The wind howled through the narrow streets, its icy breath cutting through layers of clothing like 1,000 tiny knives. St. Luke's Hospital, with its tall, imposing facade, stood as a beacon in the night, its lights casting a sterile glow on the snow-dusted pavement. Inside, the emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos, a symphony of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and the murmur of anxious conversations. Dr. Simon Keller moved through this cacophony with the precision of a seasoned veteran. Mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and a face carved by years of intense focus, he epitomized clinical detachment. His white coat flared slightly as he walked, clipboard in hand, eyes flicking over patient files with a practiced, unemotional gaze. Each note he made was meticulous, his handwriting a testament to his demand for order amidst the disorder. At the front desk, Lydia, a young triage nurse with sharp eyes and a compassionate heart, observed the flow of patients. She intercepted a new arrival, Carlos Mendez, a man in his mid-30s, his face twisted in agony, supported by his friend Jorge. The cold night air clung to them as they stumbled into the warmth of the hospital. "Dr. Keller," Lydia called, her voice low but urgent as she approached him. "We have a new intake. Male, mid-30s, severe abdominal pain. He's in a lot of discomfort." Dr. Keller didn't look up from his clipboard. "Details?" His tone was flat, devoid of any inflection that might suggest empathy or concern. "His name is Carlos Mendez. No prior medical history on file. He's in quite a bit of pain, but—" Lydia hesitated, glancing towards the waiting area where Carlos had slumped into a chair, clutching his abdomen. "But he's Afro-Latino. His friend mentioned they delayed coming in because they were worried about how they'd be treated." Dr. Keller's eyes finally shifted from his clipboard, but his expression remained unchanged. "I see." He paused, the silence stretching uncomfortably. "Put him in cubicle 4. I'll finish up here and take a look." As Lydia guided Carlos and Jorge to the designated cubicle, Dr. Keller continued his rounds, methodically checking on other patients, his demeanor cold and efficient. In cubicle 4, Carlos lay on the examination table, his breathing labored. Jorge hovered nearby, his face etched with worry. The fluorescent lights in the emergency room cubicle cast a harsh glare, illuminating every crease in the pale blue curtain that separated Carlos from the bustling hallway. Dr. Simon Keller stepped inside, the curtains swishing closed behind him with an air of finality. He approached Carlos with a clinical detachment, his demeanor calm but distant. "Mr. Mendez," Dr. Keller began, his voice steady and professional. "I'm Dr. Keller. I need to understand more about your pain to determine the best course of action. Can you describe exactly what you're feeling?" Carlos, lying on the examination table, winced as he tried to find a more comfortable position. His dark eyes met Dr. Keller's, a mixture of pain and fatigue evident in his gaze. "It started a few hours ago," he said, his voice strained. "It was sudden and sharp, right here." He gestured weakly to his lower abdomen. "I thought it would pass, but it just keeps getting worse." Dr. Keller nodded, his expression impassive. He pressed gently on Carlos's abdomen, noting the areas of tenderness. "On a scale from 1 to 10, how severe is the pain?" "About an 8, Carlos replied, sucking in a breath as Dr. Keller's hands probed a particularly sensitive spot. "It feels like stabbing." "Any nausea or vomiting? Changes in your bowel movements or urination?" Dr. Keller asked, his questions precise and methodical. "No, nothing like that. Just the pain," Carlos answered, his breaths shallow and labored. Dr. Keller made a mental note of Carlos's responses, his mind working through potential diagnoses. He turned to the sink in the corner of the cubicle to wash his hands, a ritual that offered a momentary reprieve from the immediacy of his duties. Jorge, Carlos's friend, stood nearby, watching the interaction with a protective wariness. He had been silent up to this point, but his unease was palpable. Dr. Keller's cold, detached manner didn't sit well with him. "Doctor, what do you think it could be?" Jorge's voice was tense, a mix of concern and impatience. Dr. Keller dried his hands with a towel before turning back to Jorge. "There are several possibilities," he replied evenly. "We need to rule out anything serious, like appendicitis or a possible obstruction. I'm ordering a series of tests, blood work and an ultrasound to start with." Jorge nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "And how long will that take?" "We'll move as quickly as we can," Dr. Keller assured him, though his tone remained clinical. He scribbled a few notes on a form and handed it to Lydia, who had been waiting just outside the cubicle. "Get these processed immediately," he instructed Lydia. "I want results as soon as possible." "Of course, Dr. Keller," Lydia replied, taking the forms and heading off to expedite the tests. As Dr. Keller turned to leave, Jorge couldn't hold back his frustration any longer. "Is this the best you can do, just tests and waiting?" Dr. Keller paused, his back to Jorge, the question hanging heavily in the air. "Mr. Mendez is in good hands," he said finally, without turning around. "We'll do everything we can to find out what's wrong and treat it appropriately." With that, he left the cubicle. The curtains swishing closed behind him once more. The sound was a stark reminder of the thin barriers that separated the myriad human stories unfolding in the emergency room. Carlos lay back on the examination table, his breathing shallow. "It's going to be okay," Jorge said, his voice softening as he placed a reassuring hand on Carlos's shoulder. "They'll figure it out." Carlos nodded, though the pain and fear were evident in his eyes. "Thanks, man. I know you're here for me." Outside the cubicle, Dr. Keller walked briskly down the corridor, his mind a whirl of clinical assessments and protocols. The hospital's corridors echoed with the sounds of urgency, the steady beep of monitors, the shuffle of hurried footsteps, and the faint murmur of voices. St. Luke's Hospital was a microcosm of life and death, its sterile environment a stark contrast to the raw emotions that permeated its halls. Dr. Simon Keller moved through this space with practiced detachment, his white coat billowing slightly with each step. His mind replayed the encounter with Carlos Mendez, the Afro-Latino patient whose pain he had clinically assessed. Despite the severity of Carlos's condition, Keller's demeanor had remained cold, a calculated detachment masking any semblance of empathy. He prided himself on his ability to remain objective, to see patients as cases rather than individuals. But tonight, something felt different. As he walked, Keller couldn't shake the image of Carlos's pained expression and the protective stance of his friend, Jorge. It was Lydia's words, however, that echoed most persistently in his mind. They were worried about how they'd be treated, she had said, her voice tinged with frustration and disappointment. Keller had brushed off her concerns, focusing instead on the clinical details of the case. He pushed open the door to the staff room, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sterile scent of antiseptic greeting him. The room was a small sanctuary amidst the chaos, cluttered with coffee cups, medical journals, and a few personal items left by the staff. Keller poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma barely registering as he lost himself in thought. Lydia entered the room, her presence a quiet disruption. She watched him for a moment, her sharp eyes assessing. "Dr. Keller," she began, her tone measured but firm. "I need to talk to you about Carlos Mendez." Keller didn't look up from his coffee. "What about him?" he replied, his voice neutral. Lydia took a step closer, her frustration evident. "You hesitated to treat him. You barely listened to what I had to say about his condition. Why?" Keller sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "I did what I needed to do. I ordered the necessary tests. We have protocols for a reason." "But you hesitated," Lydia pressed. "And it wasn't just about the protocols. It was about him. You saw his skin color before you saw his pain." Keller's jaw tightened. "You're reading too much into this, Lydia. I treat all my patients the same." "Do you?" Lydia's eyes bore into his. "Because it didn't seem that way tonight. You were dismissive. You didn't listen." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick between them. Keller looked away, the weight of her words settling uncomfortably in his mind. "I did my job," he said quietly, more to himself than to Lydia. Lydia shook her head. "Your job isn't just about diagnosing and treating, it's about seeing the person behind the symptoms. Carlos is more than just a case number." Keller didn't respond, the silence in the room growing heavier. Lydia sighed, her expression softening slightly. "We all have biases, Dr. Keller. It's part of being human. But we have to recognize them, confront them, or they control us." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Just think about it," she said, her voice gentler, "for his sake and for yours." As the door closed behind her, Keller was left alone with his thoughts. He sat down, the coffee in his hand growing cold. The sounds of the hospital filtered through the walls, a constant reminder of the lives depending on his decisions. He had always believed in his ability to remain detached, to separate his emotions from his work. But now, doubt crept in, unsettling and persistent. He thought back to Carlos, to the look of pain and fear in his eyes. He thought of Jorge's protective stance and Lydia's passionate confrontation. The realization began to dawn on him, a slow and uncomfortable truth. His biases, the ones he had always believed he could control, had influenced his actions. He had hesitated, and in that hesitation, he had risked a patient's well-being. Keller leaned back in his chair, the hum of the refrigerator a soothing white noise. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to question his own methods, his own beliefs. Dr. Simon Keller sat in his office, the low hum of the computer filling the silence. The test results for Carlos Mendez had just come in, and as he scanned the screen, his brow furrowed with concern. The diagnosis was clear: a severe intestinal blockage. This wasn't something that could be treated with medication or time. It required immediate surgical intervention. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Keller printed the results and headed towards the examination room where Carlos and Jorge were waiting. The hospital's corridors, though bustling with activity, seemed to narrow and quiet as he walked, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. When he entered the room, Carlos was lying on the examination table, his face pale and strained. Jorge stood beside him, his expression a mix of worry and defiance, ready to protect his friend from any further harm. Dr. Keller closed the door behind him and approached with a calm, measured demeanor. "Mr. Mendez, Jorge," he began, his voice steady but softer than before. "We have the results of your tests." Carlos struggled to sit up, wincing as the pain flared. "What's wrong with me, doctor?" Dr. Keller pulled a chair closer and sat down, meeting Carlos's eyes directly. "You have a severe intestinal blockage. It's causing the pain and could lead to serious complications if we don't address it immediately." Carlos's eyes widened with fear, and Jorge's hand tightened on his shoulder. "What does that mean?" Jorge asked, his voice edged with anxiety. "What do you need to do?" "We need to perform surgery as soon as possible," Dr. Keller explained. "The blockage is significant and it won't resolve on its own. The surgery carries risks, as all surgeries do, but it's necessary to prevent further complications." Carlos swallowed hard, his fear palpable. Surgery? How risky is it? Dr. Keller leaned forward, his tone compassionate yet clear. "Every surgery has risks, but we have a skilled team, and we'll take every precaution. The most important thing is to address the blockage now to avoid any life-threatening complications." Jorge's eyes bore into Dr. Keller's, searching for any sign of uncertainty. "How soon can you do it?" "Immediately," Dr. Keller replied. "The sooner, the better." Carlos nodded slowly, his breath shaky. "Okay, let's do it. I trust you, Doctor." The words hung in the air, a testament to the shift in their dynamic. Dr. Keller felt a surge of determination. "We'll take good care of you, Carlos. I promise." The preparations for surgery moved quickly. Dr. Keller briefed the surgical team, ensuring that every detail was covered. As Carlos was prepped for the operation, Jorge stayed by his side, offering quiet reassurances. In the preoperative area, Dr. Keller approached Carlos one last time before the procedure. "We're ready to start. Do you have any questions or concerns?" Carlos shook his head, managing a faint smile. "Just get me through this, Doc." The operating room was a sanctuary of sterility and precision, where the mundane and the miraculous intertwined. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic, and the hum of machinery created a backdrop of controlled tension. Bright surgical lights cast a harsh glow, transforming the space into an arena where life and death often danced too closely. Dr. Simon Keller entered the OR with a sense of purpose. The surgical team was already assembled, their faces obscured by masks, their eyes sharp and focused. Instruments gleamed on the stainless steel trays, ready to be wielded with the utmost care. "All right, team, let's get started," Dr. Keller said, his voice steady. He glanced at Carlos, now lying on the table, the anesthesia rendering him still and silent. "We know what we need to do. Let's make it happen." The surgical prep began with meticulous care. Every movement was deliberate, every step taken with the gravity the situation demanded. Dr. Keller's gloved hands moved with practiced ease, yet beneath his calm exterior, his mind was a whirl of thoughts. As he made the first incision, the sterile environment seemed to fade away, replaced by a flood of memories and reflections. He recalled the night's events, Lydia's pointed confrontation, Jorge's protective stance, and the fear in Carlos's eyes. Each memory was a reminder of his own humanity, his own fallibility. "Retractor," Dr. Keller requested, his voice breaking the silence. A nurse handed him the instrument, and he continued the delicate work. The blockage was more severe than he had anticipated, but his focus remained unyielding. With each precise cut and suture, Dr. Keller's thoughts wandered to the biases that had clouded his judgment. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, yet tonight had shown him that even the most seasoned practitioners were not immune to prejudice. The realization was humbling, a stark reminder that medicine was not just about healing the body, but also about recognizing the humanity in every patient. "Forceps," he called, his voice steady despite the inner turmoil. The team responded seamlessly, each member performing their role with precision. The blockage was slowly being addressed, the immediate danger receding. It wasn't enough to be skilled with a scalpel. A true healer needed to see beyond the symptoms, to understand the person behind the pain. Carlos wasn't just another case file. He was a human being with fears, hopes, and a life worth fighting for. "Almost there," Dr. Keller said, his eyes never leaving the surgical site. The blockage was finally cleared, and he could see the path to recovery for Carlos. Sutures. The team worked in synchrony, closing the incision with the same care that had marked every step of the procedure. The atmosphere in the room shifted from one of intense concentration to a quiet satisfaction. The surgery had been a success. "Great work, everyone," Dr. Keller said, stepping back. He removed his gloves and mask, feeling the weight of the night's events settle heavily on his shoulders. "Let's get him to recovery." Leaving the OR, Dr. Keller walked through the quiet corridors of the hospital, the adrenaline of the surgery giving way to a deep, pervasive fatigue. He felt the need for solitude, a place to process everything that had transpired. He found himself drawn to the hospital chapel, a small, dimly lit room that offered a rare respite from the chaos of the ER. Dr. Keller entered the chapel and sat in one of the back pews. The flickering candlelight cast gentle shadows, creating an atmosphere of contemplation. He stared at the altar, the silence allowing his thoughts to surface. He thought about Carlos, about the fear in his eyes and the trust he had placed in the medical team. He thought about Jorge, whose unwavering support had been a testament to friendship and loyalty. He thought about Lydia, whose courage had forced him to confront his own shortcomings. In the stillness of the chapel, Dr. Keller made a vow. He would not allow his biases to cloud his judgment again. He would strive to see each patient as a whole person, deserving of the best care regardless of their background. The resolve settled within him, bringing a sense of clarity and purpose. As he rose to leave the chapel, Dr. Keller felt a quiet determination. The night had been transformative, a turning point in his career and in his life. Walking back through the now quiet hospital, he felt a renewed sense of duty. The journey of self-reflection had just begun, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. Each patient, each story, would be a reminder of the vow he had made in the hushed sanctuary of the chapel. The recovery room was bathed in the soft glow of morning light filtering through the blinds. Monitors beeped rhythmically, their sounds a steady reassurance in the sterile environment. Carlos lay on the bed, his eyelids fluttering as he began to regain consciousness. His body felt heavy, the lingering effects of anesthesia still dulling his senses, but there was a subtle sense of relief, a recognition that the worst was over. As Carlos opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Jorge, slumped in a chair beside the bed, his face etched with exhaustion but softened by a profound sense of relief. Jorge's eyes lit up as he noticed Carlos stirring. "Carlos, you're awake," he exclaimed, leaning forward and taking his friend's hand. "Hey, Jorge," Carlos mumbled, his voice weak but tinged with a faint smile. "Did everything go okay?" Jorge nodded vigorously, his grip on Carlos's hand tightening. "Yeah, man. The doctor said the surgery went well. You're going to be all right." Carlos let out a sigh, his body relaxing into the bed. "That's good to hear. Thanks for being here, Jorge. I don't know what I'd do without you." Jorge shook his head, a mixture of gratitude and emotion in his eyes. "You'd do the same for me, Carlos. We've got each other's backs." The door to the recovery room opened quietly, and Dr. Keller stepped in, carrying a clipboard. His usually stern expression had softened, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He approached the bed, giving Carlos a reassuring nod. "Mr. Mendez, it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" Carlos looked up at Dr. Keller, his eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "I'm tired, but I'm okay. Thank you, Dr. Keller. Jorge told me the surgery went well. Dr. Keller nodded, checking the monitors and making a few notes. Yes, it did. The blockage was severe, but we managed to remove it successfully. You'll need to stay here for a few days so we can monitor your recovery, but I expect you'll be able to go home soon. Jorge stood up, extending his hand to Dr. Keller. Thank you, Doctor. Really, thank you. I was so worried about him. Dr. Keller shook Jorge's hand firmly, a genuine smile breaking through his professional demeanor. I'm glad we could help. Carlos looked between Jorge and Dr. Keller, feeling a deep sense of connection to both men. Dr. Keller, I wanted to say thank you, not just for the surgery, but for everything. I know it wasn't easy. Dr. Keller met Carlos's gaze, his own eyes reflecting a newfound understanding. You're welcome, Carlos. This experience has been enlightening for me as well. It's reminded me of the importance of seeing every patient as an individual and not just a case to be solved. Carlos nodded, his expression serious. I appreciate that, Doctor. It means a lot to know that you care. Dr. Keller finished his notes and placed the clipboard on the table. If you need anything, the nurses are here to help. I'll be checking in on you regularly. Just focus on getting better. As Dr. Keller turned to leave, Jorge called out to him, Doctor, one more thing. What made you change your mind about Carlos? You seemed, different. Dr. Keller paused at the door, looking back at Jorge and Carlos. Sometimes, we need a wake-up call to realize what's truly important. Carlos's case was that wake-up call for me. It reminded me that empathy and understanding are just as crucial as medical knowledge. With that, Dr. Keller left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Carlos and Jorge exchanged a look, the gravity of the night's events settling in. Looks like we all learned something, huh? Carlos said, a small smile playing on his lips. Jorge chuckled, nodding in agreement. Yeah, seems like it. Now you just focus on getting better, okay? We've got a lot of plans to make once you're out of here. Carlos leaned back into his pillows, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Sounds like a plan, Jorge. Sounds like a good plan. The recovery room, with its quiet hum and gentle light, became a place of healing not just for Carlos's body, but for the bonds of friendship and the unexpected connections formed in the face of adversity. The hospital room was quiet, save for the occasional beeping of monitors and the soft hum of air conditioning. Carlos sat up in bed, his strength slowly returning, a testament to the care he had received. Beside him, Jorge and Maria, his sister, chatted in low voices, their relief palpable. Dr. Keller entered, carrying Carlos's discharge papers, his demeanor professional but warm. Good morning, Carlos. How are you feeling today? Dr. Keller asked, placing the papers on the bedside table. Better. Much better, Carlos replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. Ready to get out of here? Dr. Keller nodded. I've reviewed your charts, and you're making excellent progress. You'll be discharged today, but remember to take it easy for the next few weeks. Follow the instructions I've noted here, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any concerns. Maria stepped forward, her expression serious. Thank you, Dr. Keller, for everything. It means a lot to us. You're welcome, Dr. Keller said, his voice sincere. I'm glad we could help. Carlos is a strong patient, and he's had great support from both of you. As Dr. Keller handed the discharge papers to Maria, Carlos cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. I've been thinking a lot during my time here, he began, his tone contemplative. This experience, it's made me realize how important it is to address biases in healthcare. I want to do something about it. Jorge nodded, his eyes bright with interest. What do you have in mind, Carlos? "I want to start a community group," Carlos said, his voice gaining strength. "We can share our stories, educate others, and advocate for better treatment for everyone, regardless of their background. Dr. Keller, would you join us?" Dr. Keller looked at Carlos, a mixture of surprise and admiration in his eyes. "Carlos, that's a commendable idea. I'd be honored to participate. It's a crucial issue, and if my involvement can help, I'm all in." Maria smiled, her pride in her brother evident. "This could really make a difference, Carlos. Count me in too." "Great," Carlos said, feeling a surge of determination. "Let's start planning our first meeting." The community center was a modest building, its walls lined with posters advocating for various social causes. Inside, the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation. Chairs were arranged in a circle, creating an inclusive space for open dialogue. Carlos arrived early, his steps purposeful as he set up the materials for the meeting. Pamphlets on healthcare equity, sign-up sheets for future events, and a small table with refreshments were all meticulously organized. His heart pounded with a mix of nerves and excitement. Dr. Keller entered shortly after, carrying a stack of medical journals and research papers. He greeted Carlos with a warm handshake. "Everything looks great, Carlos. Are you ready?" Carlos nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet determination. "Yes, I am. Thank you for being here, Dr. Keller. Your support means a lot." As they finished the final preparations, Lydia arrived, her presence bringing an additional layer of energy and support. "Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be a part of this," she said, setting down a tray of freshly baked cookies. "I thought these might help ease the nerves." Carlos chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thanks, Lydia. It's good to have you here." The room slowly filled with community members, each person bringing their own stories and experiences. The diversity in the room was striking, a testament to the widespread impact of healthcare disparities. Carlos stood up, his voice steady as he addressed the gathering. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Carlos Mendez, and I'd like to share my story with you." He recounted his recent ordeal, from the severe abdominal pain to the hesitation to seek medical help due to fears of bias. He spoke about the critical moment in the hospital when Dr. Keller and Lydia's intervention made all the difference. "When I first arrived at the hospital, I was scared," Carlos admitted, his voice unwavering. "I feared that my background would affect the care I received. Unfortunately, my fears were almost realized, but thanks to the efforts of people like Dr. Keller and Lydia, I got the treatment I needed." Dr. Keller stepped forward, his expression serious but compassionate. Carlos's story is a stark reminder of the biases that still exist in healthcare. As a doctor, I've had to confront my own prejudices and learn to see each patient as an individual, deserving of the best care regardless of their background. Lydia added, "It's not just about recognizing biases, it's about actively working to overcome them. We all have a role to play in creating a more equitable healthcare system." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. Then, one by one, community members began to share their own stories. An elderly woman spoke about her struggles with receiving adequate care due to language barriers. A young man recounted his experiences with discrimination in the emergency room. Each story added a new layer of understanding, a new perspective on the challenges faced by marginalized communities. The atmosphere in the room shifted from one of quiet anticipation to one of collective determination. A middle-aged man, who had been listening intently, stood up. "I want to thank you, Carlos, Dr. Keller, and Lydia, for your honesty and bravery. It's not easy to confront these issues, but it's necessary. We need more meetings like this, more conversations that can lead to real change. Carlos nodded, feeling a surge of hope. That's exactly what we're here for. This is just the beginning. We need to keep the conversation going and find concrete ways to address these issues. Dr. Keller added, I'm committed to this cause, not just as a healthcare professional, but as a member of this community. We need to work together to ensure that everyone has access to fair and equitable healthcare. As the meeting drew to a close, the room buzzed with energy. Attendees lingered, continuing their discussions, exchanging contact information, and signing up for future events. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, a testament to the power of shared experiences and collective action. Carlos, Dr. Keller, and Lydia stood together, watching the interactions unfold. We've started something important here, Carlos said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Dr. Keller nodded, a sense of fulfillment in his eyes. Yes, we have. And it's only going to grow from here. Lydia smiled, her eyes bright with optimism. To building bridges and making a difference. As they began to tidy up, Carlos felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The meeting had been a success, not just in terms of turnout, but in the impact it had on everyone present. The bridges they were building were strong, built on a foundation of empathy, understanding, and a shared commitment to change. The momentum of Carlos and Dr. Keller's advocacy efforts carried them from the initial community meeting to various locations around the city. Each venue, whether a small church hall or a large community center, buzzed with the energy of people eager to make a difference. The conversations were earnest, the stories shared, raw, and powerful. Carlos stood before a group of community members in a modest library meeting room, the light filtering through tall windows, casting a warm glow. We started this journey because of my experience, but it's clear that many of us have faced similar challenges, he began, his voice steady and impassioned. Our goal is to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. Dr. Keller, standing beside him, nodded in agreement. We're here to listen and to learn from each other. As healthcare professionals, we need to understand the biases that exist and work actively to dismantle them. Their message resonated deeply. The support they garnered from each meeting was overwhelming, with more healthcare professionals and community members joining their cause. The rooms were always filled with a mix of emotions: anger at the injustices, hope for change, and determination to make a difference. One evening, after a particularly moving session at a local high school auditorium, Carlos and Dr. Keller sat together in a quiet corner. They were reviewing the feedback forms, the weight of the day's stories heavy on their minds. Every time we do this, I'm reminded of how much work we still have to do, Carlos said, his voice thoughtful. Dr. Keller looked up, his expression earnest. But we're making progress. Every new supporter, every new story brings us one step closer to real change. The impact of their efforts soon caught the attention of local media. Reporters began to attend their meetings, writing articles that highlighted the urgent need for equity in healthcare. The stories of those who had suffered due to biases were brought to a wider audience, sparking public outcry and calls for systemic reform. A turning point came when a major newspaper ran a feature on their work. The article, accompanied by photos of Carlos, Dr. Keller, and the community members, captured the essence of their movement. It detailed personal stories, the challenges faced, and the unwavering commitment to change. We've been inundated with calls and emails from people wanting to support us, Maria said, her eyes shining with excitement as she relayed the news to Carlos and Dr. Keller during a planning meeting. This is our chance to make a real impact. With the increased visibility, Carlos and Dr. Keller decided it was time to formalize their efforts. They established a foundation dedicated to promoting equity in healthcare. The foundation provided resources, educational programs, and advocacy training to empower individuals and communities to fight against healthcare disparities. The launch event for the foundation was held in a large community center, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Carlos stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many new. "Today marks a new chapter in our journey," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "With this foundation, we are committed to ensuring that every person receives the care they deserve, free from bias and discrimination." Dr. Keller followed, his tone reflective yet hopeful. "This foundation is not just about addressing the symptoms of bias in healthcare. It's about getting to the root causes and working together to create a system that serves everyone equally." The room erupted in applause, the shared vision of a more equitable healthcare system uniting everyone present. The event was covered extensively by the media, further amplifying their message and drawing more supporters to their cause. As the foundation grew, so did the reach of their advocacy. Workshops and seminars were held, training healthcare professionals to recognize and combat their own biases. Community outreach programs educated people on their rights and provided support for those who had been marginalized by the healthcare system. Carlos, Dr. Keller, and their team worked tirelessly, driven by the stories they had heard and the changes they knew were possible. Each step they took, each new initiative they launched, was a testament to the power of community and the impact of a shared commitment to justice. The movement they had started was no longer just a reaction to a single experience. It had become a powerful force for systemic change. And as they looked to the future, they knew their work was far from over, but they faced it with unwavering resolve and a collective strength that would not be easily shaken. The anticipation in the air was palpable as Carlos and Dr. Keller walked through the grand hall of the National Healthcare Conference. The venue was an expansive auditorium, its walls adorned with banners advocating for healthcare equity and systemic reform. Attendees from across the nation had gathered, their collective focus on addressing the pressing issues within the healthcare system. Carlos and Dr. Keller had spent weeks preparing for this keynote speech. The weight of their journey and the stories they had gathered were heavy on their minds. As they stepped onto the stage, the murmur of the audience quieted, all eyes fixed on them. Carlos began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Mendez, and a year ago I was just another patient, scared and uncertain about the care I would receive. Today, I stand before you as an advocate for change, alongside Dr. Simon Keller, whose journey from doctor to co-advocate has been as transformative as my own." He paused, letting the significance of his words sink in. The audience listened intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and empathy. Carlos continued, "My story began with a severe medical condition and a deep-seated fear of bias. I hesitated to seek help, and when I did, my fears were nearly realized. But thanks to the dedication of professionals like Dr. Keller and Lydia, I received the care I needed. This experience opened my eyes to the broader issues of bias and inequity in healthcare." Dr. Keller stepped forward, his tone reflective. "As a doctor, I've always believed in providing the best care possible. But Carlos's case made me confront my own biases and the systemic issues that affect so many patients. It was a humbling experience, and it pushed me to become an advocate for change." Together, they recounted the steps they had taken, forming a community group, organizing meetings, establishing a foundation, and working tirelessly to educate and empower both healthcare professionals and patients. They highlighted the stories of others who had joined their cause, each one a testament to the widespread impact of healthcare disparities. We've seen firsthand how empathy and understanding can transform lives, Carlos said. It's not enough to treat symptoms. We must address the root causes of inequity. Our foundation aims to provide resources, education, and advocacy, ensuring that everyone has access to fair and equitable health care. Dr. Keller added, "This movement is about more than just individual stories. It's about systemic change. We must challenge our assumptions, confront our biases, and work together to create a healthcare system that truly serves everyone." The room erupted in applause, the audience's appreciation and support filling the space. Carlos and Dr. Keller exchanged a glance, the moment a powerful affirmation of their journey and the impact of their work. After the speech, they mingled with the attendees, answering questions and discussing future collaborations. The enthusiasm was infectious, and it was clear that their message had resonated deeply. Healthcare professionals, activists, and community leaders expressed their commitment to joining the movement, sharing their own experiences and ideas for driving change. As the day drew to a close, Carlos and Dr. Keller found a quiet corner to reflect on the event. The buzz of conversations and the energy of the crowd still filled the air, but they felt a moment of calm and satisfaction. "We've come a long way," Carlos said, his voice thoughtful. "But there's still so much to do." Dr. Keller nodded, his expression resolute. "Absolutely. Today was a milestone, but it's just the beginning. We need to keep pushing forward, expanding our reach, and deepening our impact." They discussed their plans for the future, more workshops, broader outreach programs, and stronger partnerships with other organizations. They envisioned a series of initiatives aimed at policy changes, training programs for healthcare providers, and continued support for those affected by healthcare inequities. Feeling hopeful and determined, they stood up, ready to face the challenges ahead. The national conference had been a testament to their efforts, a powerful reminder of the importance of their mission. With renewed energy and a shared vision, Carlos and Dr. Keller left the auditorium, eager to continue their journey towards a more equitable healthcare system. As they walked out into the evening light, they knew that their work was far from over, but the foundation they had built was strong. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next, united by their commitment to justice and the belief that real change was possible.